No one should be pursuing romance of this sort. That sounds very fair. The romantic relationships in Jane Eyre were rather toxic. Hello everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about the book Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and specifically I'm going to be talking about why this book is not a romance. So I'm going to start with a really brief summary. So we start the book when Jane is around 10 years old, and she spends most of her childhood with her wicked aunt. She endures a really harsh education, and later she decides to take on her own independence quest, like a quest for independence, while she still is trying to search for a place that she can belong. And then she finds this place where she essentially becomes a governess for a young girl named Adele, and there she meets Mr. Rochester. So immediately after Jane meets Mr. Rochester, he starts abusing her with his power. Throughout the book, we actually can tell that there are a lot of red flags in the story about just how Mr. Rochester treats Jane. But I feel like one of the main ones is, for example, he blames Jane for small accidents. He also refuses to take responsibility for his own actions. He belittles her, and not to mention, there's this one example where Mr. Rochester asks Jane to chat with him one evening, and through the course of the night, he basically starts criticizing her art and her musical abilities, and he asked her to play this song on the piano, and she says she's not really good at it, but he still insists, and after she plays, Rochester literally starts criticizing the quality of her performance. So obviously this is unnecessary because Jane previously admitted to not being really good at playing the piano, but still he goes and embarrasses her. Basically nothing about the romance in Jane Eyre is healthy, as Mr. Rochester is so controlling. He constantly tries to isolate her, he insults her. So now what does this mean for Jane? So there are a lot of questions that essentially are brought up when we're talking about their relationship. What if Jane essentially makes Mr. Rochester angry and has to deal with him for the rest of her life? Or what if he becomes abusive? Or what if he just wouldn't stop, I don't know, harassing her perhaps? Yeah, I mean, I think the only path for Jane after that is probably a path of poverty and a miserable life where she has to deal with him until his death or her death. I'm gonna actually be reading what Jane answers. Sir, your wife is living. That is a fact acknowledged this morning by yourself. If I lived with you, as you desire, I should then be your mistress. To say otherwise is sophistical, is false. Once again, we have so many questions. What if Mr. Rochester essentially decides that Jane was also insane, just like his wife in the attic? What if he had an eye for perhaps a new governess or for another woman, and he wanted a third wife? Or what if there was another room in the third floor of the big old house waiting for Jane? But that brings us to Bertha Mason or Miss Rochester or the insane woman in the attic. Anyways, so I must admit, when I was reading the book, I felt so bad for Bertha Mason the whole time. I don't know, I couldn't believe that back then people treated mental illnesses that way, literally locking people in the attic. So for me, looking at her character, not just from the perspective of having mental illness, but from the perspective of colonization and racism also, and being biracial, was very interesting. This is when Mr. Rochester reveals the secret that Bertha Mason is living in his attic. Yeah, that's right. So once Bertha Mason was an incredibly beautiful woman, however, he was then unable to divorce her because she became insane, and he was unable to remarry. So he does the only thing that a coherent person can do in that situation. He imprisons her in the attic in the top of his mansion for the rest of her life with absolutely no one to talk to, except a drunken servant. But that's besides the point, because Mr. Rochester, he is living the rest of his life traveling across Europe and having affairs with women. Yeah, that sounds very fair. I think it's easy to see how Bertha kind of doesn't allow Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester to marry. However, in reality, she is far from a villain because she's a victim of her circumstance. Now, try commenting below what you think Bertha Mason might represent, because in my opinion, I actually came across 3 different symbols. First, she might actually signify fear. This is because earlier in the book, when Jane was actually locked by her aunt, this was very similar to the experience that Bertha had to go through. She was locked in the attic by her husband. Not to mention, Jane just had the fear that her uncle's ghost would haunt her. So I feel like she might represent this fear that Jane has that is trapped inside of her, because Jane just has this fear that essentially she's not going to be that composed anymore, that this savagery might escape out of her. That is one theory. Another one might suggest that she can represent racism and colonization. This is because Bertha Mason is the only daughter of a very wealthy family living in Jamaica, and Bertha is a symbol for the many cultures that were essentially exploited by the British Empire, that were also actually repressed by the British Empire during the 1840s, more or less. Actually even earlier, but anyways. So I feel like when Bertha was writing the story and she was referring to Bertha as the mad woman, essentially she just wanted to represent the fear that the English had. So yeah, also not to mention that the reader actually learns everything about Bertha Mason, not through a third perspective, like a third narrator, but we learn everything through Mr. Rochester. That's right, the very unreliable character, Mr. Rochester. He is a liar, straight up liar. That's very repressive in my opinion. Not to mention, Bertha's voice is also completely silent when she is brought to England from the British colony of Jamaica. And she's basically confined in an attic by her husband. Yeah, that's right, after suffering from a mental illness. Great. Now, I can't talk about religion or colonization without mentioning St. Joan Rivers, also James's cousin, who actually tried to marry her at one point. Anyways, so basically he embodies racism and patriarchy, because he basically wanted to take Jane along his journey and impose Christianity across the other world. And it was just so weird because there was this other woman who he actually loved, and she loved him too, and she was rich and she was beautiful, and they could have married and settled for a good home. But no, why can you do that when you can actually go abroad as a missionary, impose your own religion and culture on people who are unable to defeat themselves? Yeah. In conclusion, don't get me wrong, Jane Eyre is a beautifully written book. I feel like it is a very well written story, and it's definitely worth reading. In fact, I think it's the best book I've read this summer. I really did love it. However, I think this book is anything but a romance. No one should be pursuing romance of this sort, specifically not young readers who are actually influenced by these sorts of stories. But yeah, the romance between Jane and Mr. Rochester is anything but romantic, and I just think readers should be a little bit more aware that these sort of books kind of tend to glorify toxic relationships. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.